So my name is Alycia. I come from a family of Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe. My grandparents on my mother's side immigrated to Canada from Russia, and on my father's side they immigrated to Canada from England. And I moved out here from Ontario about 9 years ago with my partner Allison. And the both of us are white colonial settlers who are very grateful to be living here on beautiful Coast Salish territory. And I've had the privilege of studying here at UBC for the past 8 years on Musqueam territory. And so I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on unceded and occupied Musqueam territory. And I'd also like to acknowledge the funding I received from CRiHHI's Institute for Aboriginal People's Health, and from CRiHHI, the Critical Research in Health and Healthcare Inequities Research Unit, and also from UBC's Interdisciplinary Studies graduate program. So I would also like to acknowledge and thank my incredible supervisory committee. Annette Brown is my supervisor, and also Madeline Dion-Stout and Jim Frankish. They put a lot of time and energy into support for me to complete this research. And so I'm grateful to them, and also I'd like to thank all of you for coming and taking the time to be here today. So in order to contextualize this research, I'll just start off by briefly providing some background to the research problem. The legacy of colonization in Canada has contributed to numerous health and social inequities for First Nations people. Yet First Nations people have never been silent on these issues. Despite the repeated call by First Nations leaders and activists to be involved in decisions that impact their communities, First Nations people are still often not involved in policy decisions, and the inequities are persistent and in some cases increasing. So over the past several decades, we've seen this pattern, a repeated pattern of government-led commissions or consultations on what is needed to improve Indigenous people's health and address the gaps we see in health and social well-being. So beginning with RCAP in the 90s, followed by the consultations that led up to the Kelowna Accord signing in 2005, and more recently with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, we've seen extensive consultations with First Nations leaders, experts on Indigenous health, and with Indigenous communities, and each resulted in a comprehensive set of policy recommendations that call for First Nations and Aboriginal people to be meaningfully involved in decisions impacting their communities. And that's because it's recognized that this is necessary for developing policies that are relevant to communities and that are effective in addressing inequities and improving health. But this isn't new or surprising for those of us working in the areas of public health, health promotion. The importance of involving people in decisions that impact their health was recognized in the 1986 Ottawa Charter, which is a cornerstone document in health promotion and public health. And again, it was recognized in 2008 with the World Health Commission on Social Determinants of Health. And since then, numerous studies have appeared in the health literature around citizen engagement. And this is evidence of the widespread recognition that improving health and addressing inequities requires involving the people and the communities who are most impacted by those decisions. However, Indigenous people have largely been excluded from this body of literature, and there's a lack of insight on what's needed to address the challenges around meaningful involvement in the particular context of First Nations health. The particular challenges of involving First Nations people in health policy decision-making can be seen through existing analyses of the Indian Health Transfer Policy, which began in 1979 and is still largely seen as having the most tangible outcomes of any federal First Nations health policy initiative in Canada. So while this policy was intended to give First Nations people, or First Nations communities, more control over health decision-making, and there have been a few studies that have shown that some improvements to health have resulted due to this health transfer, the policy is largely critiqued in the literature for primarily serving to lessen government responsibility, burden communities with the full responsibility to address their own health issues, and then blaming communities for failing to improve their own health. So this effect is talked about in the literature as an outcome of neoliberalism, and that the responsibility continues to lie with the communities to improve their own health by pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and yet not have any influence in the broader policy decisions which largely determine health. The impact of neoliberalism also contributes to the perpetuation of the historical, colonial, and paternalistic relationship between First Nations and governments, which is an enactment of neocolonialism. And so the dominance of neoliberalism and neocolonialism in the current policy climate pose significant challenges to involving First Nations people in health policy decision-making. Despite these challenges, health policy organizations and institutions are increasingly recognizing the need to meaningfully involve Indigenous people in policy, yet the literature lacks insight on how to do this. It's not clear what meaningful involvement looks like in the current policy climate, nor what we can do to foster it. While there are a few frameworks that have emerged in the literature around meaningfully involving First Nations people in environmental policy decision-making, there are very few, if any, that are specific to First Nations health policy. If health policy organizations and institutions are going to involve First Nations people in more meaningful ways, within this, that insight is needed on how to foster meaningful involvement in this contemporary neoliberal, neocolonial policy climate. The BC context presents an interesting site for investigating these issues around meaningful involvement. Following the signing of the 2005 Transformative Change Accord, then the subsequent tripartite agreement, and the creation of a new First Nations health governance structure in BC, BC First Nations are now being involved in health policy decision-making in a way that is unprecedented in Canada. Exploring issues around meaningful involvement provides an opportunity to learn from and build on the work that is currently underway in BC and can inform new ways of thinking about how to meaningfully involve First Nations people in a range of Canadian health contexts. So this research addresses the central problem of First Nations exclusion in Canadian health policy decision-making with an emphasis on what can be learned from and what can inform meaningful involvement in the BC context. This research also focuses on the meaningful involvement of First Nations people living away from home in urban settings because, as you can see in this graph, there is an increasing trend of First Nations urbanization. There are currently approximately 60% of First Nations people living off-reserve in urban settings, and the statistics show that this trend is increasing. And it's important to note that there are First Nations people who live off-reserve in rural areas, which is recognized by the blue bars in the graph. However, in this research, I'm primarily focusing on the beige bars here, which are First Nations and Aboriginal people who are living off-reserve in urban settings. So thinking about meaningful involvement in relation to the urban First Nations population in BC is relevant for thinking about how the majority of First Nations people are included in policy, and also for deepening an understanding of how a diversity of First Nations people can be involved in the BC First Nations health governance structure. This research investigates two research questions. What constitutes meaningful involvement of First Nations people in health policy decision-making in BC and more widely in Canada? And how can insights gained on what constitutes meaningful involvement inform thinking on how First Nations people living away from home in urban settings can be meaningfully involved in First Nations health policy decision-making? And throughout this research, I'll refer to both First Nations and Indigenous people interchangeably, and this is because the literature and the data often refer to Indigenous people more broadly, with the understanding that that includes First Nations people. So you might hear me using both. So I'll now briefly describe the research design, including who I interviewed, and talk a little bit about how I analyzed the data. To gain insight into the research questions, I interviewed 20 leaders and decision makers working in the area of First Nations health policy and other health policy areas, and I asked them about their experiences at decision-making tables where First Nations people were involved, as well as their perspectives on what constitutes meaningful involvement. Half the participants identified as Indigenous people and half identified as Euro-Canadian or having mixed ancestry, and approximately half were women and half were men. The participants also predominantly held leadership positions in a range of policy settings, health organizations, and research institutions, and the majority were working in the BC context. Several guiding theoretical perspectives informed the analytical lens through which I read and reread the data. I drew on decolonizing and Indigenous perspectives to foreground Indigenous peoples' voices and narratives around policy, and to focus on resistance, decolonization, and the advancement of Indigenous justice agendas. I drew broadly on the key tenets of critical theory, which helped me pay attention to power and dominance, structural inequities, the transformation of policy structures, and the epistemological assumptions within policy discourses. I drew on post-colonial feminism to focus on the gendered nature of colonial oppression and to interrogate policy discourses in relation to colonialism, racialization, and sexism. I drew on cultural safety to attune to the power dynamics inherent within policy systems and the implications for Indigenous peoples' experiences of safety within policy processes. And lastly, I drew on intersectionality to draw attention to the way multiple systems of power, such as colonialism, neoliberalism, and patriarchy, intersect with each other to shape policy processes, and how this implicates people across a diversity of social and political identities. So guided by an analytical lens rooted in these perspectives, I conducted a thematic analysis of the data to arrive at insights into the research questions. Just to briefly illustrate how I read the data through this analytical lens, I'll just provide one example of the analysis process. So I began with a reading and rereading of the data in relation to each other and identified key themes or concepts that surfaced. So one concept identified was the way participants discussed the dynamics between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people at the policy table. I reviewed literature rooted in the guiding theoretical perspectives, such as this text, which was written by Emma LaRocque. And I read this text to help make sense of the concepts reflected in the data. So in this text, LaRocque argues that the colonizer-colonized complex is a colonial construction that enables white people and white institutions to maintain power over Indigenous people. So reading LaRocque in relation to this data exposed how colonialism inherently shapes relationships between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in health policy decision-making, and also how it perpetuates colonization, this colonial relationship. So through an iterative process of reading and rereading the data in relation to literature, I identified several prominent themes that shed light on the research questions. Okay, so the following slides in my presentation will outline the findings and analysis, and these correspond to the last 3 chapters of my dissertation, which is basically what I'm presenting to you today. So I have 2 sections of findings. The first, which provides an analysis of participants' lived experiences at the policy table, and the second, which provides an analysis of participants' perspectives on meaningful involvement and their practical insights around what works for fostering meaningful involvement. And then the last section of my dissertation presents an analysis of both of these sets of data to identify 7 key elements of meaningful involvement, which are then used as a foundation for a framework for fostering meaningful involvement. So the next set of slides provide a summary of the analysis of both sets of data, and then an overview of these 7 key elements of meaningful involvement and the framework. And I'll conclude by highlighting some implications and the significance of the framework and the research overall. An analysis of participants' lived experiences exposed the dynamics of health policy tables and the implications they have for Indigenous people who participate in them. Participants talked about how the dominant culture of decision-making tables contributed to the silencing and dismissal of Indigenous people, which meant Indigenous people often have to fight for the floor in order to be heard. And one participant said, "The dominant think is so strong that people couldn't even see when they weren't listening." The data revealed that Indigenous people often have to actively strategize how to put their ideas forward in a way that would be well received, and the extensive drain of energy that goes into this constant strategizing. And one person says, "One of my ways of diplomacy is to play dumb." Indigenous participants talked about the common experience of being the only Indigenous person in the room and the only one being personally implicated by the decisions or by the racism or racist ideas around the table. And they described the isolation, emotional stress, and pain they felt from participating in various processes, and that this can lead to a withdrawal or resignation from the process altogether. And one person says, "Let's get real about how we're trying to survive some of these spaces." And this participant was actually talking about healthcare spaces, but it also reflects how the participants were speaking about policy decision-making tables as well. Participants' lived experiences at the decision-making table expose the ways that Indigenous people are often shut down, shut up, and shut out of policy processes, even when they are invited to sit at the table. This shows how meaningful involvement is often experienced as a paradox, whereby Indigenous people are excluded through the very process of inclusion. The analysis of these findings point to the ways that policy tables serve as a vehicle for gendered colonial dynamics to repeat themselves, and how this creates inherent power inequities among the people who are sitting at the decision-making table. And in this way, policy processes can actively work to dismiss, silence, and ultimately exclude Indigenous people. So I'll now share some of the findings from participants' perspectives on meaningful involvement and some of their practical insights on how to foster meaningful involvement. Many participants displayed acute awareness that colonialism interferes with Indigenous people being involved in the process. And several participants wrestled with the question of how to navigate these dynamics. Other participants had key insights around what has worked, what has not worked, and what needs to happen for First Nations people to be more meaningfully involved in health policy decision-making processes. Participants spoke about the tendency for Indigenous people to be involved in tokenizing ways. And one of the most surprising findings was that even though they expressed a clear need to move beyond tokenism, they also demonstrated that sometimes tokenism could be meaningful. One participant says, "We cannot become complicit with the appetite for tolerance, but in some spaces that tokenism is a giant step forward." Some participants explained that governments are compelled by legislation, and many discussed how formal agreements have been powerful tools for advancing First Nations health agendas, as they hold governments accountable for including and listening to First Nations people. One participant says, "Whenever someone at the table says, 'We can't do it like that,' the principles of the agreement allow us." Participants explained that what is really needed for fostering meaningful involvement is a change in the whole policy system itself. The data revealed how the policy system, along with other colonial structures, such as the education system, intersect to create a cycle of exclusion, where Indigenous people are prevented from accessing what is needed to participate in policy. The analysis shows that by taking action to transform the policy system, such as including Indigenous ways of being and knowing in the policy in policy discourses, can work towards disrupting the repeated pattern of exclusion and foster meaningful involvement of Indigenous people at the most foundational level. And one participant said, "We have to change everything. I mean everything. We have so many people controlling our lives. How can we make change unless it comes from the top?" I conducted a thematic analysis of these two sets of findings to arrive at insights on what constitutes meaningful involvement and how it could be fostered. The data analysis suggests that meaningful involvement is about mitigating the effects of power dynamics inherent in the policy system. So in sum, meaningful involvement means the process must be culturally safe, and that it mitigates interpersonal power dynamics and racism at the decision-making table and reduces harm to Indigenous people. Meaningful involvement also means the process must not only be meaningful, but must also be influential. This means that Indigenous people are influential in the process, and also that the process itself is influential. Meaningful involvement also means the process must be transformative, and that it fosters the inclusion of Indigenous people at a structural level and works towards transforming the broader policy system and the systemic exclusion of Indigenous people from policy. So to further articulate what constitutes meaningful involvement, I've identified several key elements of meaningful involvement which are briefly outlined in this table. So I'll just take a moment to orient you to this table, which is illustrating these 7 key elements in each of these 7 columns. And they're represented here along the spectrum moving this way. And Battle and Dion Stout really helped me to think about this idea of a spectrum about meaningful involvement. And my intent here is to give you a brief overview of each of these elements. And you have an opportunity to read on the screen some examples of what enacting each of these key elements might look like. And in my dissertation, I have a more in-depth table that includes a purpose, objectives, and aspirational outcomes for each of these. So this is just a brief snapshot to give you an idea. So the first key element, recognizing and representing First Nations peoples, or Indigenous peoples, is about recognizing or acknowledging First Nations people or territory in the process and taking efforts to have First Nations people represented in some way in the process, even if it's in a tokenizing way. Interrupting and reimagining relationships is about actively interrupting the ways First Nations peoples and governments have historically worked together and redefining that relationship based on a process of reconciliation. Preparing agreements is about establishing formal written agreements between First Nations and non-First Nations groups, which articulate the nature of the working relationship, mandate First Nations involvement, and hold all parties jointly accountable for decisions made in the process. Practicing protocols refers to developing and implementing rules for First Nations people's engagement in the process, as well as protocols to guide how the parties will work together. Leveraging power is about taking efforts to foster a process that has the power and the capacity to develop and implement policy decisions. Exerting community authority is about taking explicit efforts to foster a process that is driven by a diversity of First Nations community members. And shifting social structures refers to taking explicit efforts towards addressing the systemic barriers that impede First Nations people's involvement in policy, such as integrating Indigenous knowledges and paradigms into the process. So I've illustrated each of those 7 key elements in a framework that I refer to as the ripples of meaningful involvement, and ripples is an acronym of those, or an acrostic, I guess, of those elements, key elements that you see here. So this framework illustrates how even taking one small action, such as including a token First Nations representative in a process, can be a first drop in creating a series of ripples towards more influential forms of involvement. Meaningful involvement is conceptualized here as an ongoing process of reflection and taking action to deepen the level of involvement. And it's also conceptualized as a decolonizing process that works towards disrupting colonial systems of power and fostering inclusion at the most fundamental level. And it's important to mention that this framework is not intended to be a prescriptive list of criteria for what meaningful involvement should look like in every policy process, nor does it suggest that by simply recognizing Indigenous territory, all these other elements will fall into place. But I'm offering it here as a heuristic device to stimulate thinking around what more meaningful involvement could look like, and to help us think about what actions could be taken to foster more meaningful involvement in various processes. Oh, whoops, it did skip ahead. Okay, there we go. So to illustrate how this framework can inform thinking about how to foster meaningful involvement in various contexts, I've used it here to help to arrive at some strategic directions for fostering meaningful involvement of First Nations people who live in urban areas. And these are just some examples to show what meaningful involvement could look like at each particular ripple in this context, at each ripple in this particular context. So the first one we have recognizing urban First Nations people and including urban First Nations representatives in the process, supporting urban Indigenous self-organization, preparing agreements between leaders of urban Indigenous communities and governments, setting rules of engagement for what those processes would look like, involving urban leaders and policy leaders, including input from diverse members of urban Indigenous communities, and then developing policy paradigms that would challenge the on-off reserve divide, which is a colonial construction. And I'd like to conclude by outlining some implications and the significance of this framework and the research overall. There are several implications for thinking about how to foster meaningful involvement of First Nations people in health policy decision-making. The findings provide some insight into what might be needed to support Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people working together on policy issues, which participants described as a key challenge in light of historical and ongoing colonialism. The findings also point to the need to diversify the voices of First Nations people who are included at the policy table in order to prevent a First Nations decision-making elite and to prevent processes of meaningful involvement becoming another form of dominance and exclusion. And by providing insight on how to meaningfully involve urban First Nations people in health policy and thus how to make health policies more relevant to the urban population, this research informs actions towards taking responsibility for urban First Nations health, which is a significant policy gap in light of historical and ongoing jurisdictional battles and the trend in urbanization. In conclusion, this research has significance for strengthening the First Nations health policy system here in BC, as it can inform thinking on how urban First Nations people living in urban settings could be included, which may lead to more relevant and effective policy decisions for a diversity of First Nations people. Thanks.